ladies and gentlemen, we are at 7 o'clock, and it's time to get this show on the road. So today, we're going to be looking at reviewing geography of ethnicity, race, and nationality. If I get a little bit of a chance to talk some about how identity falls in there, maybe we will get a chance to do some of that too. Here's the deal. We got a lot to do in a little bit of time. So I'm going to go ahead and crank it on up and get all, in that discussion. And if y'all have any questions about anything, put it in the comments or ask a question at the bottom. You can see that. Let me click this thing. And at any point, if y'all have any questions, I'll stop and address those things as best I can. One more thing I wanted to point out to everyone is thank you so much for being here and tell your friends all about this so that I can keep my job here working with Fiveable and I enjoy doing this. One more thing I want to point out is that this week is the last week that we're going to do a freebie for the live sessions. From now on, if you're going to see the live sessions as well as the replays, you will need to sign up. And so that's something you can go to the Fiveable website and take care of. So go get on that and do it and bring your friends along for the ride too. Tell them how helpful it is for you guys. All right. Let me tell that to stop. All these schools be calling me. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to focus my screen back to the PowerPoint. And let's do it. So kind of our objectives are going to be centered on these things here. We're going to talk a lot about race, ethnicity, nationality. We're going to define these things. We're going to talk a little bit about how they're similar as well as how they are different. Okay, we're going to talk about the geographic distribution of ethnic groups within the U.S. We're going to also look at a little bit of this from a global standpoint too. All right, talk about a few places in the world, talk about a few ethnic conflicts towards the end. Hopefully we'll have time to do that some justice. We're also going to discuss reasons for segregated societies. That's something that we have a deep history of segregation in our country. We're still trying to get over that today. We still have issues with that today as well. Also, we will take a brief look at apartheid in South Africa. We're going to discuss historical and current practices of segregation, a little bit on ethnic conflicts and nationality. Definitions to start us out. An ethnicity is the fact or state of belonging. This comes from, if you Google ethnicity in the Google browser, here's what you're going to get. The Google search engine, rather. The fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. All right. A membership in a group of people who share characteristics we've already talked about in here. At this point, I'm guessing that you guys have probably already talked about culture, already talked about religion and language. Well, that language, customs, which is like part of one's culture, history, common experiences, religion, all of these things are going to play into one's ethnic identity. And there's that word identity. I didn't talk about that specifically in this PowerPoint, but when we talk about someone's identity, is how they view themselves. Okay, so there are two ways that people become identified. And that is one, you identify with something that you feel that you are. Okay. For example, I am the world's greatest AP Human Geography teacher. Booyah! All right. So I might identify as the world's greatest AP Human Geography teacher, but what about my students? They might identify me as the world's worst AP Human Geography teacher. So you can have someone who identifies with something based on how they feel about who they are, as well as the identity that people have based on how others feel about them. So we call that identifying, or there's a form of identifying, maybe identifying against. That might not be the right way of saying it. But people often have their own perception. That's maybe the word I'm looking for, is that identity can be something that's perceived oftentimes. Nevertheless, not to look too much of that right now, maybe in a little bit. When we talk about ethnicity, it's how people identify on the basis of these things here, more or less, their culture. And so it's more than just race. Here's the definition of race. It's a categorization of humans based on skin color and other physical characteristics. You guys see the difference here? So race and ethnicity, now to be clear, in the United States, we use these terms interchangeably. We might mean ethnicity and say race. We might mean race and say ethnicity. Okay. For example, if you refer to people as Jewish, let's say you have a Jewish neighborhood, you're really talking about their ethnicity. Okay. Usually, if you talk about your Black population, you're usually talking about ethnicity as well, but you use a racial categorization in order to bring about that point. So again, Black, white, these are going to be skin colors and are going to be racial attributes or racial characteristics, physical characteristics. But ethnicity looks more at the culture. So another way to kind of look at this a little bit more deeply is race a part of one's ethnicity? I feel like it very well is. The human race, there are less differences of variation between humans than there are between subspecies of dogs. And yet, if a dog is all one species, then certainly we are as well. So the point that I'm trying to make is that despite outward appearances, the differences between human beings is genetically non-existent. So to take this another way, race is socially constructed. Okay, what the heck does that mean? What does it mean if something is socially constructed? Anybody have a guess as to what I mean by that? Or have y'all heard that terminology before? When we talk about race as a social construct, what we're talking about is that it differs depending on what society believes it is. That's really interesting. Okay, so another way to look at this is, let's look at Beyonce. Okay, she is light-skinned, right? And we might refer to her as light-skinned. Everybody in this conversation knows what that means. Okay, so we would consider her, if you're looking at black or white, we consider her black. But she is very, very light-skinned to the point that if you're looking at another country like Brazil, where racial constructions are are more varied among darkness or lightness of one's skin, she would be white. True story. So just the fact that two different countries or two different societies have differing opinions about what black and white is goes to kind of back the point that I'm trying to make to you. And really, that kind of thinking is incredibly rare to us because we're raised into a society that has a very standard definition for what race is and the differences that come with it. I'll challenge you today to think about that and listen more so to the culture that goes along with that, rather than to assume that people are different mainly on the basis of simply skin color or bone structure or whatever it might be that we're going to talk about today. When we talk about ethnic minorities, we're looking at a group that has different national or cultural traditions from the main population. I hope that I put it in this slide. I think I did. What I'm going to show you guys later on is that you may have seen in the news, or if you follow certain things, or if you talk about this in class, that the United States there's not going to be a majority in the United States around the year 2050. Excuse me. What's going to happen is that the white population, if y'all studied this in Unit 2, right? The white population is at replacement level, maybe even lower than replacement level in some parts of the country. And as time goes on, over time, we're going to have less than 2.1 kids, total fertility rate, being born to white families. What I'm saying here is that white population is really kind of staying where it is, or even in decline. Whereas, in particular, Hispanics, other Asian groups, or other groups coming into the United States, or other lower income groups are growing more rapidly in their population. And when I say lower income, I mean mainly like maybe second born or second generation immigrants. Okay, maybe among other groups. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that there's going to be, because of migration and because of natural increase in minority groups, you're going to see the population become way more balanced in the United States, to the point that the white majority, right now we're somewhere around 57% white in the United States, is going to be more like a 49% minority. So we're going to be a large minority white country, but everyone's going to be a minority because we're going to be less than that 50%, making there be no clear majority in the United States. That's what we're talking about here. So I wanted to make that point as well, that we are becoming more and more culturally diverse as time goes on in our country. Here's a map that shows our country by ethnicity. And this one here, we're looking at all kinds of different ethnicities. Those are really hard to see. You got Dutch, English, Finnish, French, German, Hispanic, Irish, and so on. Mexican, Norwegian, Puerto Rican. All right, a bunch of different groups represented here on this map. Usually, we probably just branch all these different European groups as white. We think about African Americans living in mainly the U.S. South, and also keep in mind, we're going to look at this a little bit more closely on. You've got large centers of population over here in some of these counties where large cities exist in other parts of the country as well. And then you've got large numbers of Hispanic groups on the southern portion of the United States, as well as in parts of the Panhandle of Florida, and in other parts of the United States as well. This right here shows the same information in the form of a chart. Okay. Now, again, keep in mind that these groups, German, Irish, English, Italian, even Polish, French, Scottish, these are all going to be groups that we have over time assimilated completely into American culture, so that we look at all these individuals from these different walks of life or these different ancestries, and we think, oh, they're white dudes, okay, or they all look, or we classify them as white. And when we say white, we're talking about a race, but we kind of mean a ethnicity. Though the ethnicity word for that may be Caucasian, okay, someone of white European or Anglo-European descent. Another thing that I want to point out too, while we're talking about, is when you look at Mexican, notice it says of any race, okay? So you've got varying skin colors. When we talk about race, we're talking about physical attributes, varying skin colors of people living within Mexico. So it might be Mexican be black, it might be Mexican be white. So often in your same for Puerto Rican, usually you'll see something that says Hispanic white or Hispanic non-white to kind of break down this ethnic variation whenever you're filling out a form. All right. And so we've all filled out forms and we see these different types of categorizations or classifications. The point that I'm trying to make here before I move on is that when you look at people within any one country on earth, there is going to be different identities within the geographic breakdown of any one country on a smaller scale. And also when you look at Central and South America, for example, and you summarize all these individuals as Mexican, that right there is incredibly, inaccurate, also incredibly insulting to people from wherever they might be, that their culture is not seen as important enough to have its own identity. So when we classify something very broadly like this, we need to do it sensitively and also recognize that there is a lot of cultural nuance and a lot of different identity factors that go into that. Here's another example of the ethnic diversity of Iran. Now, this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. We already talked about this last week, that these guys are Muslim, but not only are they Muslim, what branch of Islam are they? Anybody remember? Put it in the comments. What branch of Islam do we have primarily in the Islamic Republic of Iran? Remember, there were two that we talked about more than the others. Two that you really need to know. Nobody remembers. They're Shia Islam. All right. So primarily, like 90%, somewhere around 90% of Iran is going to be Shia Muslim. All right. But then you've got these other groups along the outer perimeters of the country, even within, that may be something different. For example, you look at the Kurds up here. We're going to talk more about them later on in this presentation. Kurds they're not Arab either. So not only are they not Shia, but they're not Arab. All right, they're Kurdish. They're a completely different ethnic group with a different language, a different history, a different culture, really altogether. They're not in any way similar to the Iranians. That's why there's a lot of controversy with their existence as well. We're going to talk more about. Here is the country of Myanmar. Some of you might know it as Burma. I don't know how much y'all watch the news or how much y'all may have talked about this when you look at migration in Unit 2, but I always spent time, I guess I spent time a lot last year in my own classroom looking at the Rohingya Muslims. Now, in Myanmar, the majority of individuals here, and you can see you have a very ethnically diverse country, but the majority here are going to be Buddhist. And you think usually that Buddhism is very, very passive, very, very peaceful type religion, but in this particular case, the Rohingya Muslims that live over here in this region are heavily persecuted against by the Buddhist majority, to the point that even there are cases of perhaps ethnic cleansing that would go on. Regardless, there has been a massive migration, as many of, maybe even a diaspora, if you want to use that word there. Many of these Muslims have moved into neighboring Bangladesh or have gone into some of the islands down here in the in Oceania region, trying to get out, and they're staying in refugee camps and things. This is really kind of a big deal. It's because of ethnic differences. They don't fit in with the majority here being your Buddhist majority, and so they are oppressed as a minority group within Myanmar. So this happens worldwide. It probably happens more in countries where development is an issue as well. Even still, if you want to really look at a crazy and diverse ethnic situation, go no further than Africa, mainly sub-Saharan Africa. And we're going to look more at this as well towards the end if I have enough time. But you can see this clear transition. I actually have a slide later on that shows the transition zone. It is a geographic zone in Africa that is right south of the Sahara Desert. All right. But not only is it a geographic transition zone, it is also quite, literally a cultural transition zone as well. Most of the people in the north, even though you still got a lot of ethnic variation, most of the people in the north are going to be Arabic. A lot of them are going to be Muslim. They speak Arabic. All right. Once you get south of the Sahara, we call this region sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that the ethnic diversity becomes way more amplified. You've got tons of ethnic variation, and they don't follow the political barriers. You can kind of see the political boundaries a little bit overlaid on this map. That's a major problem. When you have all these different ethnic identities, ethnic groups living within a single boundary or even split by boundaries, because Africa's boundaries were decided at the Berlin Conference with by a bunch of Europeans. They had no care whatsoever about the ethnic diversity in Africa. That causes major political problems today that we still see in places like Rwanda, in places like South Sudan, in places all throughout the continent. Looking more at the United States, once again, we want to look at the racial profile of the United States in 2045. Here's what I was talking about a little while ago, where you're going to see the white majority become a large minority group. Right? When I say minority, it's going to be less than half the population. Even though it makes up the largest group, it is still not going to be half of the population. That's the reason why we're calling this 49.7% in 2045 a minority. Is everybody clear on that? Because yes, it's still going to be a majority. It's still be a large minority of whites, almost 50%. But in order for something to be a majority, it's got to be 50% or more. And that's the connection I'm trying to make. And also keep in mind here, look at these different groups here. Black, again, we already talked about as a racial classification, but when we use it in this context, we're looking at really African Americans. Got to be careful with that, though, because we just talked about how you can be Black and Hispanic. When I was in college, I had a friend of mine who would often be classified as Black, but he's from Sri Lanka. All right. And he felt like people automatically would look at him. And even though he didn't look African American whatsoever, he would be classified as African American. He felt like people didn't take the time to understand his ethnic identity until they talked to him and heard his thick Sri Lankan accents. All right, so Black, again, doesn't necessarily mean African American, but the way we use it, it usually does. So that's another thing that makes race and ethnicity so complicated, is the way that we tend to interchangeably mix the two. In the green, you've got your Asian. Now, again, Asian is very, very broad. We use this as an ethnic classification in the United States. The majority of Asians in the United States are going to be Chinese. They're not the same as Korean, not the same as Japanese, not the same as Indian. Indians are Asians, y'all. Indians are from South Asia. If you're from Pakistan, you're from South Asia. If you're from Bangladesh, South Asia. So there's a lot of different ethnic groups and different identities and different nationalities, to use a word on that to talk about, that make up this Asian demographic within the United States. But also know that we got about 8% of our population is going to be Asian. This, again, is looking at 2045. So maybe I should, I think I've got these numbers in current. I hope I do later on in the presentation. All right, so ethnic groups are going to be based on cultural factors. Just to kind of review what we already talked about. Asian Americans, that's a really, really broad term, like I just said. Jews, racially and nationally diverse, but are bound together by common religion, customs, and values. Language, the Hebrew language is a big part of that. Usually, if you're going to be Jewish, you're going to learn at least enough Hebrew to read the Torah. That is, if you ever go to synagogue, the Torah is actually read in Hebrew. It's pretty cool. They use I don't know if you guys ever seen a Torah scroll, but they use a little pointer. I can't even remember what it's called. But it looks really cool. It's very cool. I had a college class where it was taught by a rabbi, and we spent a little bit of time in the synagogue. Now, I mentioned here at the bottom, depending on the strength of a group's ethnicity, members may be pressured to make friends or have relationships only within, or I guess primarily within their group. This also happens because of the fact that people see safety and similarity. All right, so we talked a little bit in migration. Your teacher surely talked a little bit about chain migration. This idea that you might have some immigrants come from one country and land in one place in the United States, and then after sending word back home to some of their family and friends, you might see where more people move to that same community. They're not going to just land in some random place. They're going to go to where they have more of a chance through a networking of people like them. In that same way, people tend to just automatically segregate on the basis of where their interests are. You see this a lot in TV. You see this a lot in your high school cafeteria, right? Different ethnic groups, different racial groups, different sports interests, different music interests. Whenever I was in school, I played cello. I still play cello, and I would hang out in the orchestra, right? We would go and hang out in the orchestra room and practice, and just all of us music people. So you would find places where people have similar interests to you, and you hang out. All right. So I'm not saying that this is because of systemic segregation that people tend to do this, but naturally people sit where they feel more comfortable in places like cafeteria or wherever it might be. In the same way, when you look at a larger scale, people tend to form these ethnic neighborhoods, which are going to be also known as an ethnic enclave. If you're taking notes, I would write down both of these words. They mean the same thing. Okay. In fact, I think the Aaron Foberg book uses ethnic neighborhood, and just a lot of things use ethnic enclave. A political enclave is going to be like a country that's kind of off by itself, right? Or surrounded by another country, or a political unit that's surrounded by another country. So when we talk about an ethnic neighborhood or an ethnic enclave, it's literally an area within a city that contains members of the same ethnic background. And you see things like Little Italy or Little Havana or Chinatown. There are Jewish quarters in places like big cities like Boston and in New York City, where you have just nothing but Jewish people living, and you got different places like this for different ethnic groups. That's what we mean by ethnic neighborhood. So a lot of times you'll see people kind of organize themselves spatially on the basis of how they identify. Ethnicity is going to be an identity with a group who share the same culture. We've already talked about that. Race is going to be biological. Here's the thing, though. Even though we kind of looked at race as something that's socially constructed, right? Something that we kind of define what it means to us based on who all is. By the way, there was I don't know what the link. There's a YouTube video where these people talk about their ethnic identity. I would try to get it for you guys. If I don't have it tonight, I'll have it with me next time that I do a conversation. It's really cool because these people talk about their own race and ethnicity, how they identify themselves. But here's the point that I'm making, is that for it to be something that's socially constructed, distribution of persons of color matter. And it doesn't just matter to geographers, ladies and gentlemen. It matters to all of us, big time. One's skin color, one's racial skin color, that means nothing in terms of their humanity, simply a way of human beings classifying other human beings, can determine where they reside, attend school, spend their leisure time, and perform life's daily activities in some society. That's a big deal. Well, you might be thinking, I don't know if I believe that. Or I worked hard to get to where I am. Let me show you something. All right. This one here is New York City by race. Now, you can't really see the city boundaries, but what each dot represents, in this particular key, each dot represents 500 people. And look at how really segregated, for lack of a better word, the different ethnic groups are going to be. All right. Notice you got your large white groups clustered together, your large black groups clustered together, your Hispanic groups clustered together. I mean, everyone's kind of like what we were just now talking about, right? They kind of go to wherever they might feel comfortable going, or where other people like them exist and form these ethnic neighborhoods. You got the same kind of a pattern in Chicago. This is a little bit more zoomed in. The scale is different. Every dot represents 200 people. You've got your black population kind of actually extending out even further. You've got whites kind of scattered out here along the outskirts, but also a large white concentration over here on the eastern end of the city, kind of northern eastern end. And then you've got your Hispanic groups kind of on each side of this wedge, if you will, of the black population. We're going to talk more about this in a minute, but, well, I won't get ahead of myself. Let's read this. My own state of South Carolina. I love South Carolina. Sense of place. Are y'all familiar with that terminology? Sense of place. Not sense of place. All right. So what I mean by this is we tend to grow associated, or maybe even include within our identity, the geography where we are most comfortable. That plays a lot into what I'm talking about here. I feel very, very comfortable, and I just love South Carolina. I wouldn't have it any other way. Maybe I could stay in the mountains of North Carolina because that's just beautiful. But I am all the way South Carolina. Listen to this. In my own state of South Carolina, those same counties on the low side of economic and education spectrums also have significantly higher African-American populations. Counties in the PD, Williamsburg, Lee, Marion, Marlborough, and Dillon, have both, listen to this, the lowest median incomes in the state and some of the most heavily African-American populations. Let me show you this. This map. Here's the same quote right here. I just left it in. The map is showing you the largest concentrations of African-Americans in our state. The darker the color, the larger the African-American population. So it's between 55 and 73% African-American in these counties here. And then the other, any dark blue color has a large population of African-Americans. If you look in the lighter colors, yeah, they're up to 18 to 24%. So it's a really, if you go back up here to the map I showed you a little while ago, we already know this, right? There's the majority of African-Americans in our country live in the South. Okay, because of a historical legacy with that. There's a lot of history in this, okay? If you look at South Carolina in and of itself, you can see that there's a lot of history in the individual places on a smaller scale for why African Americans are distributed where they are. Here's the problem. This right here is the income. The income. the lighter the color, the less money is made in these areas. Now, to be fair, South Carolina isn't like high loading it here. We're not super rich down here in South Kakalaki. In these areas, Richland, Charleston, Berkeley, Greenville, York, the median income in all these places where people are making the most money is somewhere like in the 40,000s. So we're not high rolling it here in South Carolina, and I'm cool with that. But if you look at these places down here where the highest density of African Americans live, you can definitely see that there is a correlation between income being basically poverty and the African American population in our country, in our state. Which countries are the wealthiest? We just talked about which counties. We just talked about that. So this right here is what we call the I-95 corridor. What we're looking at is the place where the majority of blacks live in the country, or in the state, is also the place that is the hardest hit economically, educationally, in terms of jobs. Look at this. This here is in 2009. This is after the Great Recession, which really hit our state hard, but hit everyone hard. You can see the places that suffer the most are going to be places right here in this I-95 corridor. President Obama, whenever he was he was running for president in 2008, before he became our president in 2008, he actually spent some time here. This region is known as the Corridor of Shame, and it's still pretty shameful how poor and how disenfranchised, more or less, this area is and the people that live there are. So you can imagine, looking back at our maps, that if this is the place where the least amount of wealth is, there's also a least amount of opportunity, meaning that if people are born in those areas, what are they destined to do? They're destined to be poor like their parents. I'm not saying that's always the case, but statistically, you can see correlations between the success of people's parents and what they have the ability to do, and with the opportunity that exists for their kids. If you live in a place where everyone's poor and the unemployment is super high and poverty is crazy and there's no after school activities, and some kids have to work instead of going to school, and they have teachers that are underpaid and overworked and no resources, in some cases no textbooks, in some cases no classrooms. Yes, it's that bad. Then what do you expect? But even worse than that is that why is it almost entirely African American, and how does that correlate? It does, y'all. It does. There's a video that I put in here. Jeez. We'll come to it at some point. I'll link the video in here, like a URL that I would challenge you guys to go ahead and take a look at. We'll get to it a little bit further down when we talk about redlining, for sure. We'll talk more about this. A few things I wanted to show you before we get to that point is every 10 years, there is a census, all right? And that's how we kind of figure out where everyone lives, okay? So the census helps us to understand as a country, one, how the population shifts from one place to another. So when we talk about population, you guys probably talked about the census a little bit in Unit 2. We use the numbers from that to figure out which states get new, higher numbers of politicians versus which states that don't, based on population shifts. All right, Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, these are the three largest ethnic subgroups in the United States. When I say subgroup, I mean ethnic minority. African American is not the largest American minority. They're not. Hispanic Americans are. Hispanics are not only, well, I guess in recent years, you see a trend where less and less actual migration is taking place, but the populations tend to have higher natural increase, okay? And African-American natural increase is actually low, like whites. So African-Americans are somewhere around 10% of the overall U.S. population, more than that in the American South. Hispanics make up somewhere around 16%, all right? When you look at the distribution of ethnic groups in the United States, it looks kind of like this. Which ethnic group you're looking at? Hispanic or Latino. Why do we see the most Hispanics and Latinos living along the southern United States, kind of in the southern and western region? Distance decay. Y'all remember that term from Unit 1? Distance decay. All right, so in other words, people tend to go, or a phenomenon tends to take place in places closest to its point of origin. All right, there's no one on earth makes the decision to move randomly. All right, I moved to the part of South Carolina where I live. I live in a small town just outside of Augusta, Georgia, but in the South Carolina side. And I moved from Columbia, South Carolina, because I was looking for a job, right? People move for reasons that make sense. In this case, people are trying to move to the United States looking for opportunities from Central and South America, which has led to large amounts of immigration and large population clusters along the border with Mexico, or closest to places like Cuba, or places like Puerto Rico, or places like even Central America, where people are just able to sail up and get into parts of the Panhandle of Florida. I also want to show you this because remember we were talking about religion last week, and notice that the Catholic population looks very similar to the ethnic Hispanic population. Well, that's because Catholic Christianity is heavily and widely practiced by Hispanics. All right, so the majority of Catholics in the world, we talked about this last week, live in Central and South America. Well, you see that reflected here as well through their ethnicity in the United States. The majority of blacks in our country live in the American South, but notice also that you've got counties, you see my mouse, counties in parts of the North that have large African American populations as well. Now, if you look at this, you've got Chicago right here. You've got Detroit right here, right? You've got St. Louis right here. These northern cities became, I guess, targets of migration from African Americans trying to escape the South during the Great Migration. Right. So what I'm talking about here is this is a period of time during Jim Crow, a little bit, you're into the early 1900s, maybe more like the 30s or 40s. A lot of people start moving up to the North in search of jobs or in search of opportunity to do anything, get a better life than what's going on in the South, where you still have lynchings and the KKK. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that everything was rosy and perfect in places in the northern part of the country, but it was way better. There was an excellent book called Black Boy by Richard Wright. He was a civil rights advocate during the civil rights movement. I was assigned to read this book in a class I took in college, but it was a really good book. And the first half of that story talks about his efforts to essentially pocket. He worked at a movie theater. He pocketed half of the box office earnings in order to afford a one-way trip up to I don't know where I can't remember which city he moved into. But these still have large African American populations going back to that. Now, they're starting to be more of a counter migration. A lot of African Americans are coming back to the South, but that's for a different story, a different day. Asian American groups, primarily in Hawaii, that makes sense. Parts of Alaska. And what city is that? San Francisco. All right, very, very large Asian population there as well. Makes sense because the Pacific Ocean is the border essentially between Asia and the United States. And so distance decay, people are going to travel the least amount of distance they need to when Ravenstein's laws. So that's why you have that there. So we've already, this here is what we're just going to talk about, where ethnic groups tend to place themselves within certain regions of a certain location. So in Chicago, we've already seen this. You've got, this here is a different way to look at it, but you've got your Hispanic population, your African-American. No, I'm sorry, this is not Chicago. This is Los Angeles, all right, in California. By the way, Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. The biggest in terms of population is New York City. The third biggest is Chicago. International migration and ethnicities. So when we talk about, hopefully you guys spend a little bit of time looking at America's immigration history, and you've already talked about this forced migration from Africa into the United States that was endured by people who were captured and sold into slavery by Europeans. It's captured by other African kingdoms and sold to Europeans in exchange for things like guns and rum. Most Asian Americans and Hispanics are descended from voluntary immigrants. All right, so that's a little bit of a difference there. Okay, I'm not too worried about this. This stuff, I'm going to skip this stuff because this really is migration, and I'm not too worried about that right now. Hopefully, if y'all have any questions about the transatlantic slave trade or the triangular trade system, let me know. But for now, I'm going to skip that, and I want to look at even further than that. All right, so this here is looking at Asian American populations by country of origin. Remember, we broadly categorize 8% of our population as Asian American, but this here goes to show that of those groups, again, Chinese is the largest, Indian is a large percentage, the Philippines, we consider that part of East Asia. All right, a large group of people, Japan, Korea, not the same place. All right, anybody ever heard of K-pop? Part of a Korean culture, a very, very huge cultural influence in Asia. All different Asian groups right there. Internal migration of African Americans. The Great Migration and interregional migration from the United States South into northern cities during the first half of the 20th century. Again, trying to escape, looking for better opportunities, looking for work, trying to get out of the South. Interregional migration from inner city ghettos to outer city and inner suburban neighborhoods during the second half of the 20th century, kind of classify more modern look at African American migration. And again, like I said just a little while ago, very, very recent, you start to see this kind of reverse migration trend with more African Americans coming back from those cities in the north into places in the south where their parts of their family may still live or where they feel a strong connection to the geography on the basis of this is where my ancestors are from, so this is where I want to go and where I want to be. So geography plays a really big important role in the movement and distribution of ethnic groups. Here is a graphic that shows the Great Migration into some of these key cities, which we already looked at: St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit. Cleveland was one of the destinations. Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and also over here in the West, San Francisco and Los Angeles, mainly Los Angeles out of the two of those. Now, looking at this a little bit further on, what starts to happen here is this idea of the expansion of the ghettos, essentially. The expansion of these ethnic neighborhoods is where I'm looking for, into areas kind of in the suburban area, away from the city center, and became known as ghettos. Now, the word ghetto actually originates from World War II, and when we're looking at the ghettos that were established, or the terrible placing, the terrible housing that were in these areas they put Jews before they started the final solution. Okay, these areas were known as ghettos, and Jews were forced to live there, and they didn't have adequate sanitation or education or any of these things. So when we look at ghettos today, it kind of means the same thing, except that maybe they're not so. Maybe it's not our country pushing people to live in these ghettos or pushing the existence of these ghettos to grow, but maybe it is. Maybe it is. This here is the same. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. Look down here at the bottom of this slide. Many whites fled their neighborhoods when blacks began moving in nearby. And this started to happen in the mid-1900s. Okay, so from roughly 1950 into all the way up to 2000, and really in some places today it still happens. You see a lot of people of color, but mainly African Americans, might move into what was traditionally a white neighborhood, and the more people of color move in there, the more white people tend to move out. And not only that, but this mentality was propagated, if you will, by real estate agents. Here are three terms that I want to give you. And the first one is white flight. We just talked about this. When blacks move into a neighborhood, whites would move out. All right. Blockbusting, however, is kind of like adding fuel to the fire when it comes to white flight. Real estate agents would pick up on this, and what they did was they established a practice of saying basically, hey, well, we've got these black people moving into our neighborhood, and so your property is about to go down considerably in its value, and really the best thing you can do now is sell your house and go move somewhere else, okay? And real estate agents would take advantage of this and say, buy these houses for really cheap, and then go back and sell them a little bit more pricey to blacks. It's pretty crooked, all right? This here is the process, like I said, of blockbusting. It added to the phenomenon of white flight in some of these cities. So you can imagine the places where maybe in the inner city there was large African-American populations. Now, as white flight takes place and blockbusting takes place, you literally grow those ghettos, or those ghetto areas, outward from the city. So I think I've got a map. Well, hopefully I'll get to it in a second. If not, we'll go back and look at Chicago and see how this happened. But the last of these practices that I need you guys to know, or that you should definitely know for the test, is going to be the practice of redlining, right? And all of these things are related. All of them are related. Redlining is when a bank refuses to give loans to someone on the basis of where they live, because they're like, based on where you live, you're not going to be able to pay your loans. Wow. No. If we look in South Carolina, and we already talked about how people live clustered in different ethnic groups, wouldn't the places where they have the least amount of money also kind of be the places where the most blacks live? Yeah. So what you're looking at here is a policy that is essentially racist in the way it's established. They say that they're not going to loan to someone on the basis of they don't feel like they can get their money back, which makes sense when you think about that. But then it's really what it really is we're not going to loan you money if you're black. And there are some cases, even today, where you might see people that make more money than me, that are black, that have a hard time getting a house than people that are white. People of color, even today, have a harder time getting a mortgage. Look at this. Here's the video I was just telling you about. If I had time, man, I'd show it to you right now. I don't want to do that. It's here. I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of time to write it down. All right, go ahead and write this down and watch it. It's like maybe a 7-minute video. It has a big old fat F-bomb at the very beginning, so watch out for that. You know, parental guidance advised. But it really is very eye-opening about the practice of redlining. So if you're confused about how that looks, or if you want to know more about it, please go watch this video and forgive the big F-bomb. The practice of racist policies, such as redlining and blockbusting, has led to racial iniquity that persists to this day in all walks of our society. Another thing that I didn't include in the slide that I should have is in the South, God bless the South. I love living where I live, not necessarily South Carolina, but in the South, there are schools that have, in the last 3 or 4 years, had their first integrated proms. Now you might think, how in the world can that possibly happen? Google it, guys. You can see where there are schools that had their first integrated prom. You've got places where the railroad tracks separate not only racial identity, not only racial ethnicities, but also people on the basis of how much money they have. People on the eastern side of the railroad track, western side, go to affluent white school. People on the eastern side go to the poor, predominantly African American school, or whatever the ethnic diversity might be, not white. There's other groups where I was just reading an article about Charleston, not Charleston, no, Charlotte. Charlotte being a place where you would think that people will be born into having more opportunity than their parents, but in fact, in Charlotte, they have less opportunity than what their parents have. This is regardless of race. But one of the things is that the black population there suffers because a lot of the more affluent parts of Charlotte, the white parents with the most income may send their kids to a private school that's predominantly white, where right down the road, the public school is going to be predominantly black and is going to be suffering because, you might could have more money or more resources and things that come into the school, but people choose to go private rather than to share that across ethnic lines. This here is the opportunity atlas I was talking about. This here is the map that correlates with the article. You can see that places in the South are really, 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 really low on this opportunity index. What I mean by opportunity is like my generation, and definitely y'all's generation, is like we're like the first collective groups in U.S. history that is not necessarily likely to be better off than our parents were. All right. Every successive group since the origin of our country, the kids have done better economically in terms of opportunity than their parents have. But you're starting to see where in parts of the country, based on geography, that may not be the case, which points to a simple fact. Based on where you are born, it could play into the environmental factors there, could play into whether or not you're going to be successful. And that, man, that we need to do something, right? Don't we need to do something? This here is a graphic that shows students suspended from school compared to student population by race, sex, and disability status, school year 2013-2014. I'm going to read this to you. It's kind of hard to understand, but it points to a central theme, okay? This chart shows whether each group of students was underrepresented or overrepresented among students suspended out of school. For example, boys were overrepresented by 18 percentage points because they made up 50% of all students, but nearly 70% of the students suspended out of school. So you would think that if boys made up 50% of all kids in school, then the amount of kids suspended that were boys should be somewhere around 50%, right? If the amount of all students or maybe 30% are African American, then why would you have, like in this situation here, it says representation of students suspended out of school compared to student population by level of school poverty? It doesn't matter which one you're looking at this. If blacks are going to be 15.5% of the population, why are they making up 23.2% of all the suspensions in the school system? So when we look at data, and that's what this is data, it's numbers. Statistically, you're more likely to be suspended if you're black. So that makes us ask hard questions. And we know that there's not there's not a such thing really. You can't race is socially constructed. Race is based on color of skin and physical attributes. It's not based on DNA and intelligence. So why in the world blacks being written up more? There's another study that shows that by the time kids are 10 years old, usually we think about kids still as innocent or as having some degree of innocence. Well, socially, based on perception, more people feel that black boys in particular lose their innocence factor sooner than other kids of other colors of the same age. Does that make sense what I just now said? So a lot of it is social perception. So race, even though it's something that may be socially constructed, is very, very real in the implications and the geography, which makes it definitely something that's worth studying. These are geographers are really concerned about, or I guess are really interested in understanding racial geography for these reasons. Here's Chicago again. As you can see, the expansion of the African American population outwards as these ghettos form from the outside of Chicago. All right, that's the reason why I put that there again. Again, looking at white flight, you can see that the white population in Detroit goes up by 1950. After the Great Migration period, you start to see way more African Americans moving in, and the whites moved out as that occurred. Now, one more thing that you want to point out here is that this tail end from 2000 all the way down to 2010, and you can imagine it would go down to 2018. Detroit's population is declining still. In general, the population in Detroit is declining. It's kind of like a ground zero for trying to, I guess they're trying to figure out ways to revitalize the economy of that city. It used to be a very big manufacturing city. Steel was kind of a big deal there. Automobiles and all that is in decline. So in general, the population is going down, but you can definitely see this white flight right there. Segregation by ethnicity and race. You've got Plessy versus Ferguson. I had to throw this in here because this is something you definitely need to know. This here is where the idea of segregation became the legal law of the land. And it's because of the separate but equal doctrine that became a part of this Plessy versus Ferguson case. Essentially, what it was saying is that as long as the blacks and whites were given things on equal basis, segregation is okay. But when you start to say whites go here and blacks go here, and you start to segregate anyway, inherently that means that it's not going to be the same. And you start seeing that with not just drinking fountains and restrooms and restaurants, but you see that with schools and things that lead to opportunity. Jim Crow, what this refers to as is the kind of de facto matter of fact laws that existed in southern states. They were not necessarily law of the land after, but they were state laws. They were state laws that were enforced by state governments, and the federal government had very little ability to do anything about it. That's what led to the Great Migration. In South Africa, they had very, very similar thing going on, kind of correlating with our civil rights. Well, I guess with our racial policies. In fact, really, apartheid went all the way up until the early 1990s. You guys heard of Nelson Mandela? I would write his name down. Nelson Mandela was an advocate for equal rights in South Africa. Apartheid is the name of their Jim Crow, more or less. Some of the differences in South Africa is the majority population in South Africa was, in fact, black, whereas the majority population in the United States was white, but the whites still held the power in South Africa and still oppressed the majority blacks. Nelson Mandela actually went to jail for a huge amount of time for his advocacy for black rights in the apartheid South Africa. But after the first free elections in South Africa, he was named to be the president of South Africa, and was kind of globally revered as a hero of civil rights. He only recently died, I want to say somewhere around 2010, 2011. I can't remember exactly when it was. Here's a picture of apartheid South Africa. Now, I'm almost out of time, so I want to talk a little bit about nationality, and then I'll probably go and wrap it up. And next week, what's next week? I gotta make sure I'm planning. Probably the next time we meet, we're going to start looking at political geography, and I'm also going to probably talk a little bit about the ethnic diversity in places like the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia, as well as parts of Africa, because really we need to have those conversations, but they do kind of overlap with political geography. So that's kind of the direction we're going to go. But when we look at nationality, the definition is very similar to ethnicity. Sometimes you get mixed up. Well, I guess this particular phrase comes out of the, I think, Rubenstein textbook, but nationality is going to be identity with a group of people who share a legal attachment to a particular country. So if you talk about your nationality, I would consider myself American. If I talk about my identity, sure, I would consider myself American, but I might also consider myself to be South Carolinian, or maybe even more subdivided than that. Nationality shares concepts because it is linked to one's sometimes to one's religion, language, and material culture. In particular, if you're looking at a nation state like France, where people speak French, they all basically have the same views when it comes to religion or when it comes to politics. Okay, nationality differs mainly from ethnicity in terms of its legal standing. That's the main thing. And oftentimes we use those two words interchangeably. Okay, so we might use the word nation to refer to an ethnic group. Sometimes we'll do that, and you can tell by context what's meant. But in terms of definition, a nationality is going to be a legal tie to a particular country. Here's an example of what that might look like. Nationality identifies citizens of the United States. Ethnicity identifies groups with distinct ancestry and cultural traditions. All right. And those cultural traditions can be religion or language or whatever it might be. And race distinguishes blacks and other persons of color from whites on the basis of the skin color. All right. So that right there, honestly, is where I'm going to wrap it up today. The stuff on the ethnic groups and ethnic conflicts in parts of Asia and parts of Africa, and in particular, the Balkans is the main thing I want to focus on there. We're going to talk a little bit about that next week. right, when we get into political geography. So are there any questions that you guys might have about anything we talked about tonight, or in general, if y'all have any questions about what you're learning in class? Well, don't forget, if you find this helpful, tell your friends. And also make sure that you sign up for the service so you can watch the replays, and so you'll be able to watch the live sessions from here on out. And I will see you guys next week. Thank you very much. Peace.